Thank you, Hannah, for that kind introduction, and thanks to everybody for being here. I hope you had a restful spring break and are ready to dive into, I think, somewhat heavy topic. I'm also grateful to Todd Hamilton and to Doug Massey for inviting me here today, as well as to Mary Lou and the rest of the staff here for helping to organize this really great visit. So this presentation, as Hannah graciously mentioned, is a part of my larger book project, which I call Documenting Immigrants. In the book, I combine about 5 years of interviews and ethnographic observations with Latin American origin immigrants and their families, as well as analyses of secondary survey data to examine the range of effects that contemporary immigration policy and practice have on immigrant communities. I focus in particular on 4 guiding questions in the book. The first asks how immigrants who hold a range of legal statuses perceive and respond to the risk that the US immigration system poses to their daily lives. The second assumes that fear is a dynamic rather than static response to the threat of deportation, and asks in what contexts immigrants' fears become amplified or muted, and why. I then turn to consider the consequences of these different risk assessments for immigrants, their families, and their communities, before finally turning to consider larger questions about how we understand the role of inequality, of legal systems in shaping inequality in the United States. But today's talk zooms in on the first of these questions, asking how non-citizens, both legal and illegal, perceive and respond to the threat of deportation that frames their daily lives in the United States. And I consider what these perceptions reveal about how the US immigration system governs non-citizens in this country, as well as broader implications about system participation, risk, and uncertainty as underlying larger questions about legal status as an axis of inequality in the US. The key puzzle I seek to explain is why the non-citizens in my study with the most secure legal statuses sometimes perceive the greatest risk of deportation from the country. And to do so, I offer the concept of system embeddedness, which I define as inclusion in the formal records of the US immigration system as a source of risk, and exclusion a source of safety, as one solution to this puzzle. It's no surprise to anyone in this audience that in June 2015, Donald Trump launched his campaign for president of the US by promising to deport 10.6 million undocumented immigrants from the country. His hardline stance was surprising at the time, although for many observers of contemporary immigration policy and practice, it was nothing new. Republican and Democratic politicians alike have long billed undocumented immigration as a threat to American society. And this depiction historically has given way to policies that generate this political, economic, and social exclusion of undocumented relative to documented immigrants. And scholars describe how holding a documented or legal status, with some exceptions, helps to overcome much of this exclusion. So to summarize this growing body of literature, undocumented immigrants are expected to fear deportation in their daily lives by virtue of their precarious legal status, but documented or legal immigrants need not do so because of the relative stability their legal status affords them. At the heart of this characterization, I find a question of system involvement and avoidance. Research on system avoidance theorizes how criminal justice contact or involvement impacts relationships with individuals' other relationships with record-keeping bodies like schools or hospitals in ways that likely harm these individuals' families. And scholars suggest that this concept applies as well to the US immigration system, suggesting that undocumented immigrants are on the run from record-keeping bodies seeking to deport them. And for their part, documented immigrants of various designations are expected to feel pretty secure on the radar. Researchers suggest implicitly or explicitly that a legal immigration status is sufficient for promoting non-citizens' sense of inclusion in American society. And yet, system avoidance, as applied to the criminal justice context, may not fully reflect the diverse experiences that non-citizens have with the US immigration system. Federal legislation enacted since the mid-1980s complicates the idea that holding an undocumented status alone is a clear demarcation of legal stratification among immigrants. So before 1986, you might think of the primary dividing line between immigrants as separating them between legal and illegal categories. These are colloquial terms. The illegal group contained undocumented immigrants who lacked any authorization to be in the country, whereas the legal group contained a diverse set of immigrants holding various types of documents, including visa holders, green card holders, and naturalized citizens. Now, importantly, before 1986, research converges on the idea that documented immigrants of various designations, as well as naturalized citizens, experienced incorporation in American society pretty similarly in their daily lives. They were not really on the run from federal immigration authorities looking to detain them, and once they had settled in the US, they were pretty good and stable for as long as they were authorized to be here. But this narrative changes a little bit, and by a little bit I actually mean a lot. Post-1986, where non-citizenship, rather than undocumented status per se, came to represent an increasingly important axis of inequality among immigrants. First, this is the biggest change, I think, is that rather than divide immigrants into legal and illegal groupings, immigration law drew an additional bright line between naturalized citizens, legal immigrants, and undocumented immigrants. And this bright line was important because it meant that only naturalized citizens, under most conditions, would become legally immune to deportation. Within the legal grouping of immigrants, dozens of legal statuses were created, and so many, in fact, that it would take about 25 slides for me to show them all to you in any sort of reasonable way. Even as this number of legal statuses has proliferated, the number of pathways for documented immigrants to reach US citizenship has decreased. So this means that when popular cries for immigrants to get in line and follow the law have increased, the number of pathways for immigrants to do that have actually decreased. And among those in the illegal category, the conditions under which these immigrants' exclusion from their local communities and jurisdictions have expanded through a growing number of partnerships between federal immigration authorities and subnational law enforcement agencies. And finally, immigrants across the categories could now be deported for any number of what you call aggravated felonies. But these aren't just your run-of-the-mill felonies, like assault or indecent exposure or homicide. Because even misdemeanors in the eyes of criminal law, like using your somebody else's social security number to work, for example, is an aggravated felony in the eyes of immigration law. So these changes to immigration policy and practice since the mid-1980s urge a consideration of the different ways that non-citizens may perceive the risk of deportation, regardless of them being legal or illegal. So to examine the diverse ways that immigrants perceive the risk of deportation, I draw on data gathered over 3 years with 55 Latin American origin immigrants in 28 households in Dallas County, Texas. Families with at least one child between the ages of 3 and 8 were recruited using a probability-based sampling strategy for a MacArthur Network study called How Parents House Kids, directed by one of the fearless audience members sitting there, Kathy Eden, for how white, black, and Latino families make residential decisions. The team, we selected households from a random sample of all addresses, nested in a random sample of 18 census block groups, stratified by income and racial composition. So we randomly selected low, middle, and high income Black, white, Hispanic neighborhoods, stratified also by income, and randomly sampled addresses and knocked on a lot of doors. The response rate was about 80% over the first 2 summers. So this is importantly not a representative sample of Latino households, nor is it a representative sample of Latin American households living in Dallas, Texas. But I use these data because I think they're ideal for assessing the effects of an immigration system, because respondents were not selected for their legal statuses or their past experiences with deportation or the US immigration system. But the data contain a range of these experiences, including immigrants holding a variety of legal statuses, as well as those with a variety of experiences with the US immigration system. Importantly, including non-experience. So this presentation is based on data collected in 2013, 2014, and 2015. I did go back in this past summer in 2018 to ask about people's lives under the Trump administration, And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but unfortunately it's embargoed until my book is out. So you can ask. I might not be able to share it all. So the initial interviews in 2013 asked for respondents' entire life histories, focusing on their transition to adulthood, as well as their childhood memories, as well as any residential experiences that they might have had in Dallas. In 2014, we asked additional questions about respondents' experiences as immigrants, but we did not directly probe for legal status in the realms of employment, education, neighborhoods, and more. And then in 2015, I returned to the field to ask more directly about how legal status and contacts with the US immigration system structured respondents' daily lives in the US, but also focusing in on their local context of Dallas. Respondents have diverse legal statuses and diverse experiences with the US immigration system. 30 are undocumented, which means that they lack any legal status at all. About 8 are of a liminal status, which Cecilia Menjivar calls those who live in a legal limbo with a temporary visa or discretionary-based status like temporary protected status or DACA. 11 are legalized, defined here as a green card holder or the synonymous lawful permanent resident, and 6 are naturalized citizens. Among all 55 respondents, 15 report having ever been detained or deported for immigration-related reasons. And it's important to note that this is a settled sample in the US. They've all been here since about 2001. So they've been here for about 14 years at the time of the third interview. And the study is set in Dallas County, Texas. And so as a setting for the study of immigrants' risk perceptions, the site leans somewhat negative in its receptivity toward immigrants, although it's not as severe as a place like Phoenix, Arizona might be. At the time of the interviews, Texas lacked legislation similar to Arizona's controversial SB 1070, this famous Show Me Your Papers law. But the governor and the attorney general have actively worked to undermine immigrants' sense of stability in the state by opposing sanctuary city ordinances, leading the legal battles against DACA and DAPA, as well as a number of other policies that we can talk about. And with looking in at Dallas, which includes the city of Dallas and several surrounding suburban areas, the city itself, or the county itself, has a strong Hispanic origin population, many of whom are immigrants. And so in Dallas in particular, this might serve a protective mechanism, where to be undocumented often means to be Latino, but to be Latino does not necessarily mean to be undocumented in the context. As well as other features of the city, of the county, like falling outside of the 100-mile border zone where immigration enforcement is most visible and has greater authority to sort of intervene on immigration-related matters, and having a sheriff who actively opposes immigrant criminalization and actively refuses to cooperate with ICE may also further insulate non-citizens in their daily lives, and particularly in this study, from the threat of deportation, and may lead to diverse risk perceptions related to the threat of deportation. All right, let's talk some findings. Remember that the puzzle I seek to explain is that the non-citizens in this study with the greatest legal attachments to the US in the form of legal status sometimes report the greatest threat of deportation. And I'm offering the concept of system embeddedness as one solution to this puzzle. The idea refers to individuals' perceived visibility to institutions that maintain formal records. It is one involvement through which involvement in this system entails risk and non-involvement safety. I define risk here to mean how a system represents the cause of possible damage. The idea recognizes that legal status, as Roberto Gonzalez says, is a master status in that it structures and delimits the range of rights and privileges available to undocumented relative to documented immigrants. But system embeddedness also illuminates how papers alone do not insulate documented immigrants from deportation or feelings of instability, particularly when involvement in the bureaucratic side of the immigration system that manages legal status and legalization can often make involvement in the punitive side that processes and manages the deportation operations more likely. System embeddedness reveals how even good types of involvement, like holding a legal status, can thus represent a pathway to surveillance and punishment. It builds on research that suggests the chilling effects of federal policies by outlining how some non-citizens can opt out of involvement in the US immigration system that they view with trepidation. But if chilled out of opportunities for legal status or legalization, these effects will likely extend to their US citizen family members as well, including their children. So the first dimension that I outline in the paper, in the larger paper, although I won't get into it too much here because it's aligned with prior research, is how respondents' involvement in the punitive side of the US immigration system that processes deportations affects their sense of stability in the US. The basic punchline for this segment of the sample is that anyone who's ever been detained or deported fears additional punishment going forward, that they relate with involvement in other record-keeping bodies, so similar to the system avoidance idea. But a second way to be embedded in the US immigration system is through your bureaucratic involvement, that basically legalizing or holding a legal status. Here I find that despite their various legal statuses that renders them relatively less likely to be deported than undocumented immigrants in a probabilistic sense, the documented immigrants in my study often frame legal status as a pathway to punishment and report fearing deportation. Let's put some meat on these theoretical bones. So Samantha is a 25-year-old mother of 3 who left Mexico for the US in 2005. She was undocumented for several years upon her arrival in the US, but has held a DACA permit since 2012. When I spoke to Samantha in 2015, however, she reported having felt more secure without DACA protections than with them. And this is before Donald Trump's rise to the American presidency, remember. She attributes her increased personal risk of deportation to an unpredictable political landscape, saying this is something temporary. You never know. They may take it back. And then you'll go back to being just like everyone else, the other millions of undocumented people. Now, Samantha's prediction, I think as most of us know, became a reality in September of 2017 when President Trump rescinded the executive order that established DACA. And although DACA's fate remains uncertain, being aware of how to navigate the law has become even more critical for Samantha, who fears that her outing herself to the federal government as having lived in the US as undocumented makes her primary on the list of the government's targets for deportation. She says you have to live cautiously. Whatever mistake you make, you end up tagged in the system. If you're driving and you get a ticket, you have to pay it. If you don't pay, you could then get arrested. That could lead to deportation. One way or another, they are going to try and find a way to get rid of us. You always need to be aware of what you do and any infractions that may happen. My only advice would be to live cautiously. This sentiment is not just shared by Samantha in the sample. Araceli, another DACA recipient, has had a similar experience, having entered the US undocumented in 2005, receiving a DACA permit in 2012, and currently maintains that status up to 2018. But it was not always clear that Araceli would actually apply for DACA. The uncertainty associated with telling the federal government she was in the country undocumented almost stopped her from applying. Araceli explained to me in 2015 how she did not initially believe the immigration system would work in her favor, particularly as a Mexican national. She says, as a Mexican, you feel more suspicious about everything. At least that's my opinion. I feel suspicious about everything. I was not going to make such a strong move and go to the immigration office and say, hey, I'm here, just me all by myself, because I think you can. But I didn't want to send all of my information to the immigration office and have them find a mistake or something like that. And because of that mistake, I would receive my deportation notice, and this is over. This uncertainty about approaching the immigration system can have serious consequences. Araceli, probably better than most of the respondents in my study, understands the value of American citizenship for promoting a sense of stability in the United States for immigrant populations. Her father had lived in the U.S. undocumented for several decades as an undocumented farm worker, and had been eligible for the 1986 amnesty that would have granted him and his family citizenship. But he decided not to apply, because he was uncertain about whether he wanted to subject his family to life in the U.S. Araceli told me he was going to have his family in Mexico, because for him, living in the U.S. was not life. But where are his children now? He was a fool. My brother and I still do not forgive him for that. He should have applied for the citizenship anyway. Araceli now lives in the US with an undocumented husband and with no discernible pathway to citizenship going forward, with a sunsetting temporary legal status, and sees no other recourse for legalization going forward. Now, this risk extends to even legal permanent residents in the sample, those who are ostensibly permanent residents of the US. Yahaira is the key example here. She's a 45-year-old lawful permanent resident from Mexico who lives on the outskirts of Dallas. I asked her to contrast the worries that she had when she was undocumented to the worries that she has as a green card holder. And she concluded, after some thought, that the undocumented that she knows lead more peaceful lives than permanent residents such as herself, who must be vigilant about following the law or risk deportation. I don't see the undocumented living hidden. I didn't feel I was hidden before getting my residency. It was normal. I see that they live more peaceful lives than me. They have more advantages than me, a resident, because I take a minute and think, if I try to cheat, it'll appear in the system and La Migra will take my residency away. But the undocumented don't think about it. They can do whatever they want. Why? Because they don't care. They can't be investigated. They don't have a social security number. Now, Yahaira is wrong in many ways, but she's also right to some extent. Oh, I pressed back. A primary source of her worries is her involvement in the bureaucratic side of the US immigration system, this social security number that tracks your every movement in the United States, that she sees as a record-keeping body that actively seeks to punish those included inside it. She warns that green card holders shouldn't drink, you shouldn't be heading in the wrong direction, because all of that will appear in their system. That is the first thing they are going to check, whether you have a bad record or not. She goes on to describe how some lawful permanent residents, such as her cousin and her nephew, have even let their green cards expire in order to opt out of the US immigration system. She explains how this decision to opt out of legal status can have long-lasting consequences, particularly if the federal government makes available a pathway to citizenship one day. Who knows what's going to happen to them? Maybe if some new amnesty is implemented, they won't be able to do it because they are already in the system, registered by La Migra. People think, no, La Migra doesn't know anything, but they know everything. They get into the system and they know everything because it appears there on the record. Everything appears there eventually, she told me. Okay, so the fears of immigrants in my study who are caught and punished and those who are illegal and afraid are strikingly similar. They are embedded in the formal records of the US immigration system, and they fear stiff penalties should they be apprehended for a violation of immigration law. But in order to make claims about how system involvement affects the sense of stability in the US, you also have to talk about system non-involvement. And the only respondents in this study who are not involved in any side of the US immigration system is those who entered the US undocumented and who were not caught at the border, or since they've even lived in the United States over the last 15 years. Their experiences reveal how legibility to the US immigration system alienates them and their US citizen family members from opportunities for involvement in mainstream society. Let's take the case of Josefina, who's a 29-year-old Mexican mother of 2 children who has been undocumented since she first entered the US in 2005. During our 3rd interview together in 2015, I asked Josefina to tell me when she worries about deportation. And her response, without hesitation, was to challenge the premise of my question. Why would I have to worry about that? She went on to explain that because I don't know immigration officials and they don't know me, she had no reason to worry about the threat of deportation in her daily life. Now, I admitted my surprise to Josefina, noting that there is nationally representative survey data that suggests that about 67% of undocumented immigrants living in the United States consistently report fears of deportation. She recognized that while many might have that concern, she does not count herself to be among them. She says she's never lived the shut-in life that she sees on the news. I can do everything. I go to all the places. I do all the normal things. I hadn't really thought about it until just now. I'm never thinking that if I go out, I'll never come back. She paused. It's an awkward pause, a long pause. I don't know what it is I can't do if I don't want to get deported, Josefina said after some thought. She began flailing her arms. What, go stand in front of La Migra and declare I'm undocumented? I really don't know. So these are surprising facts. This is a surprising perspective that she told me. But it makes sense when considered alongside a number of contextual features. At the individual level, Josefina's lack of direct experience with the immigration system. She's lived in the US for over 10 years at this point and has never interacted with immigration and says she's never even seen them in her local context. At a more relational level, Josefina's parents and her husband helped to instill in her the idea that she could lead a normal life in the US, but they also represent a source of safety for her should she meet her untimely deportation from the United States. But features of her local context also matter. So her partner entertained the idea of moving to Virginia for a work opportunity in 2014, which she says would have doubled their yearly household income of $16,000. But Josefina refused to move. She explained that she's comfortable in her predominantly Latino neighborhood in Dallas, where she has yet to witness any displays of immigration enforcement in the context and does not want to risk moving to a new city. But Josefina draws a line where she says, "I'm fine where I am, but I will not change my status." So there's perhaps no clearer manifestation of this dynamic than when she considered whether to apply for DACA. Remember that DACA was created in 2012. It's a discretionary category. It grants a driver's license, work authorization, and reprieve from deportation for eligible undocumented immigrants who plead guilty to having entered the US unlawfully. It's associated with a number of great outcomes for those who have it, like improvements in mental health, education, income, and more. But despite her eligibility, Josefina shared in 2015 that DACA is something that's, quote, "not for me." She continues that for us Mexicans, the point is not getting caught. Why would I let La Migra find us? I've always been okay here. I'm not legal here, but I'm not thinking, oh, I'm not legal, or I'm living badly. I'm not traumatized, and I don't lose sleep over it. For Josefina, the perceived risk of deportation she associates with approaching an untrustworthy immigration system outweighs the benefits that she sees that she could get if she were to participate in it. Because outside the system, she at least views herself as invisible and insulated from the threat of deportation. Rocio, another undocumented immigrant, shares many of Josefina's sentiments. We met in 2013, and Rocio and her husband were expecting their third child. And during that interview, Rocio proclaimed what seemed provocative at the time. "To me, La Migra does not exist." Like Josefina, Rocio's border crossing experience went without incident. She and her mother both entered the US via airplane with using other relatives' American passports to cross through the border. They got through undetected. But unlike Josefina, Rocio now sort of is a typical dreamer in that she sort of lives in the US, has an unmarked English accent, and often a little bit of a Texas twang when she speaks. But surprised by her seeming nonchalance to the threat of deportation, I asked Rocio in 2014 why so many undocumented immigrants seem worried about deportation, even though she doesn't. She says that it's a whole different world than her own. I mean, you hear on TV that people are getting deported and that people are getting stopped, but to me, it's a whole different world. To me, I've never had a problem with that. I've never seen it happen around me, and I don't know anybody near me who's had that problem either. But the situation changed by 2015. 1 month before our third interview together, Rocio's mother had been detained and deported to Mexico. Rocio narrated a rapidly escalating series of events that led to this incident. Her mother, who had been living in San Diego, had a whirlwind romance with a long-lost love from Mexico, who was a long-time permanent resident. They married, and Rocio's mother received a new green card through her spouse. The couple decided to leave California for North Carolina, where the husband's family lives, and along the way, they planned to visit Rocio in Dallas. It would have been the first time in 5 years that Rocio had seen her mother. But as Rocio recounts, a checkpoint in nearby McAllen, Texas would keep the mother and daughter apart. This is a very long quote, so I'll only present a couple of bits. They were actually over here in McAllen, Texas. They were very close to me, and I was very excited. I was going to see my mother, and the next thing I know, my sister is calling me. She says, "We're at the border, and there's people being pulled out." I said, "No, it'll be fine." The next thing I know, she's like, "Mom's getting pulled out." And I asked, "What?" She said, "Yeah, Mom is in custody." I asked, "Why? What's going on?" The next thing I know, nobody's answering their phones, nobody's answering texts. Then her husband calls me, and he's like, "They deported her. Your sister, who's a US citizen, went with her too. She didn't want to leave her alone." I asked what happened. He said that her fingerprints were in the system. And even though she already did her time as punishment by leaving the United States as punishment for having entered undocumented in 1992, she's still in the system. My mother's a very nervous person, She freaks out really fast, and she signed papers agreeing to her deportation, and they deported her. She's already getting on the plane. This happened around at 12 at night. By 4 a.m., her mom was in Tijuana. These events, in Rocio's words, had undone everything that her mother worked for in her quest to become a permanent resident. But these experiences did not trigger worries that Rocio too could be deported. Instead, it only confirmed to Rocio that no good could come with approaching the US immigration system. She says that despite her eligibility, she sees no point in DACA. They only give you more privileges, but they can take them away whenever they want. It's always temporary. I guess it's a 2-year period and you have to renew it again. It's like, why? Just letting the government know where we are, who we are? It's a different way of keeping us in control and all together. They give us a little bit more, but what they take from us is way more. No, I don't really see any point in it. So through analyses of these semi-structured interviews with Latin American families in Dallas who report a range of involvement in the US immigration system, I find a complex relationship between system involvement, avoidance, and deportability. Now, although the undocumented respondents in my study recognize that holding an undocumented status leads to a precarious life in many ways, they sometimes believe themselves less vulnerable to deportation than undocumented immigrants, or than documented immigrants. For their part, despite the relative stability of their legal status, documented respondents sometimes view themselves as more vulnerable to deportation than undocumented immigrants. And I use the concept of system embeddedness to explain these findings. It illustrates how involvement in the US immigration system is risky for non-citizens under certain conditions, as well as these perceptions' long-term implications for non-citizens and their families. Some undocumented immigrants may be chilled out of involvement in a system that they view as punitive, even when entitled to the rights and privileges a legal status confers. And this chilling effect extends to documented immigrants in my study, who sometimes view their legibility to the US immigration system as inseparable from their potential for punishment from it. The findings highlight how the US immigration system has converged on legal and illegal immigrants alike to sometimes incentivize certain types of non-involvement and system illegibility. This illegibility has consequences that reach beyond non-citizens and to their citizen children, by denying them opportunities for political, economic, and social mobility that they're entitled to as US citizens. This concept of system embeddedness illustrates the diverse ways that non-citizens relate system involvement to deportability. System involvement in the form of legal status, to be clear, remains an important dimension of immigrants' integration in the United States. But given documented and undocumented immigrants' shared vulnerability to deportation since the mid-1980s, as well as the increasing convergence between who is affected by the threat of deportation between these two categories, legal status may not represent a straightforward indicator of non-citizens' real or perceived stability in the US. The multiple lines that subordinate immigrants, legal versus illegal, citizen versus non-citizen, each contain multiple forms of political, economic, and social exclusion that require greater recognition. System embeddedness also refines an understanding of how legally vulnerable populations relate to institutions that combine punitive and integrative goals. So my findings suggest that system embeddedness, rather than system avoidance per se, more fully reflects non-citizens' involvement in the US immigration system. System avoidance, developed by people like Alice Goffman and Sarah Brain, describes the spillover consequences of criminal justice involvement for individuals' involvement in other record-keeping bodies, like schools or hospitals. But system embeddedness focuses on a single institution and considers how different types of involvement within this one institution can be perceived as risky. Perceived visibility to the immigration system can sometimes lead to avoidance, but system embeddedness also demonstrates how good types of involvement, like a legal status, can represent a source of fear. Other regulatory and service-oriented bureaucracies that combine these same missions, punitive and integrative, may exhibit similar dynamics. And finally, system embeddedness, I think, helps explain why some immigrants may not participate in legalization programs that fall short of citizenship. The fieldwork on which this study is based, or at least this presentation, preceded Donald Trump's election to the American presidency. But the shared vulnerability to deportation is not new. It's been around for several decades. So as the federal immigration system comes to be perceived as more punitive and more unpredictable, undocumented immigrants may become less willing to legalize if there's no long-term pathway to citizenship. Documented immigrants also may question their visibility to the US immigration system that falls short of citizenship, asking whether it's worth subjecting themselves to its unpredictability. Fears of the federal immigration system may thus keep immigrants outside the system where they might find feelings of safety, even when involvement in it makes their and their US-born children's lives better along objective indicators. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to a Q&A.